The temperature was not a number, it was a weight. Minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It sat on your shoulders, it pressed against your eyelids, it turned the air into something solid, something you had to push through just to move. Private Mac McKenna did not know the strategic situation. He did not know that 3 German armies were moving west. He did not know the name of the town behind him. He only knew that he could not feel his feet. He had not felt them since Tuesday. He knew that the condensation from his breath was freezing on his scarf, forming a crust of ice that scratched his chin every time he turned his head. And he knew that the trees ahead were moving. The Ardennes forest, December 18th, 1944, dawn. The light was gray, the snow was gray, the faces of the men next to him were gray, everything was monochrome. Mac was in a listening post 50 yards forward of the main line. He was 19 years old. He held an M1 Garand rifle. Serial number 284491. Weight 9.5 pounds. It was the greatest battle implement ever devised. That is what they told him in boot camp. A semi-automatic miracle. 8 rounds. Fast. Reliable. American steel. In the training camps of Georgia, the rifle smelled like oil and hot metal. Here it smelled like nothing. The cold had stripped the scent out of the world. Movement at 12 o'clock. A shape detaching itself from the white background. A ghost, then another. White smocks. Helmets painted with whitewash. Fallschirmjäger. German paratroopers. They were moving quietly. Professional. They were 40 yards away. Mac's training took over. It was automatic. No fear yet. Fear takes time. Reflex is instant. He raised the rifle. The stock welded to his cheek. The cold wood burned his skin. He found the front sight post. He centered it on the chest of the lead figure. Center mass, just like the range. His finger went to the trigger. He couldn't feel the metal. His index finger was a block of wood inside a wool glove. He squeezed. He expected the recoil. The slam against his shoulder, the flash, clack. The sound was small. In the vast, frozen silence of the forest, it sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Clack. The hammer fell. The firing pin moved, but the rifle did not fire. Mac squeezed again. Panic rising now. Clack. Nothing. The German soldier stopped. He turned his head. He had heard it. He looked directly at the bush where Mac was hiding. The M1 Garand had not failed because of design. It failed because of chemistry. The standard issue lubricant, the oil that kept the action smooth in Georgia, had changed state. At 20 below zero, the oil became glue. The firing pin was moving through molasses. It didn't have enough force to strike the primer. The greatest battle implement ever devised was now a 9-pound club. Mac did not scream. You don't scream when you are freezing. You just move. He dropped to his knees behind the log. He cursed. A low, breathless string of obscenities. He grabbed the charging handle with his right hand. He pulled. It wouldn't move. The bolt was frozen shut, welded by ice and congealed grease. The Germans were shouting now. A burst of machine pistol fire shredded the bark above Mac's head. Wood chips rained down on his helmet. Mac rolled onto his back. He put the butt of the rifle against the frozen mud. He placed the heel of his boot against the charging handle, and he kicked it. He kicked his own weapon once, twice. The ice shattered. The bolt flew back. A live round spun out into the snow. It looked like gold against the white. He let the bolt slam forward. He prayed the friction had warmed the oil enough. Just enough. He rolled back up. The German was closer now, 20 yards. Raising an MP-40, Mac aimed. He didn't breathe. He squeezed the dead piece of wood that was his finger. Bang. The noise was deafening. The rifle bucked. Yeah. The casing ejected. The German dropped. Mac didn't celebrate. He didn't feel relief. He stared at the receiver of his rifle. Smoke curled up from the breech. The heat of the explosion was the only warmth in the entire world. He had 7 rounds left. He knew the math. He knew the cold was waiting to turn the oil back into glue the moment he stopped shooting. The battle hadn't started with a strategy. It started with a kick. General Patton called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. General Patton was not sitting in a hole near Crinkle with frostbite on his trigger finger. He was not doing the arithmetic that kept Mac alive. The arithmetic was simple and cruel. 8 rounds, that was the God number. 8 rounds meant you were safe. 0 rounds meant you were dead. The problem was everything in between. Mac shifted his aim. 2 gray shapes moving on the right flank. He fired. Bang, bang. Two brass casings spun into the snow, melting little pockets of slush before freezing instantly. 5 rounds left. 5 is a bad number. 5 is a coffin number. It is too many to waste, but not enough to stop a rush. Mac ducked back behind the log. His breath came in sharp, painful gasps. The cold air felt like swallowing glass. He looked at the receiver of his rifle. He wanted to reload. He needed to reload. With a bolt-action rifle, like the Springfields of the last war, you could open the bolt and slide 2 fresh cartridges in. You could top it off. You could always be full. The M1 Garand did not allow that. It was an industrial machine designed for mass production, not for the nuances of fear. It fed from an en bloc clip, a piece of stamped sheet metal holding 8 rounds tight. You put it in all at once. It came out all at once. You could not easily add rounds to a half-empty clip, not with numb hands, not under fire, so Mac had a choice that no manual mentioned. He could keep fighting with 5 rounds, knowing that when the Germans rushed, his gun would go dry after 5 seconds. Or he could eject the 5 good bullets, dump them into the mud, and load a fresh clip of 8, waste ammunition to buy certainty. It felt like a sin. The Army taught them that every bullet cost money, every bullet was precious. But the Army wasn't here. The Germans were firing again, a machine gun this time. An MG-42, the sound was distinct, not a rhythmic thumping like American guns. It was a tear, a continuous rip of fabric. Brrrt. Bullets chewed the top of his log. Mac made his choice. He couldn't risk the empty chamber. He pressed the clip latch on the left side of the receiver. He tried to catch the clip as it ejected. He failed. His hands were just mitts of dead meat. The clip, with its 5 live rounds, sprang out with a metallic ping and vanished into the deep snow. Gone. 5 rounds of .30 caliber armor-piercing ammunition lost to the Ardennes. Mac didn't look for them. He couldn't. He grabbed a fresh clip from his cartridge belt. The canvas was frozen stiff. He had to tear it open. He pulled out the block of 8. It was cold. So cold it felt sticky. He jammed it down into the receiver. He pushed with his thumb. The bolt snapped forward. He hit the operating rod handle with his palm to make sure it seated. 8 rounds. He was full again. He had wasted 5 bullets to gain 3. It was terrible math. But it was the only math that mattered. He raised the rifle again. The cold metal sucked the heat right out of his cheekbone. He waited. He didn't have to wait long. They did not come as individuals anymore. They came as a wave. The gray shapes merged into a wall. The whistle blew, a German whistle, sharp and trilling, and the forest floor stood up and ran toward him, 200 yards. Mac stopped aiming. You don't aim at a wall, you just point. Bang, bang, bang. He was firing a rhythm. It wasn't about hitting a specific button on a tunic, it was about putting metal in the air, keeping the wall back. Bang, 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 ping. The sound cut through the noise of the machine guns. The empty clip ejected, cartwheeling over his helmet. Silence. For 2 seconds, Mac was unarmed. A man with a stick. He reached for his belt. His fingers were stiff claws. He fumbled. He dropped 1 clip into the slush. He swore. He grabbed another. His eyes were wide, staring at the gray shapes closing in. 150 yards. He rammed the clip into the rifle. He pressed down with his thumb. Hard. You have to force it past the catch. The spring tension in an M1 Garand is heavy. It wants to close. It is hungry to close. Mac pushed. He felt the click. The clip was seated. Now, the danger. The bolt was held back only by the pressure of his thumb. To load the weapon, you have to release pressure slightly and snap your thumb back instantly before the bolt slams home. In training, they drilled this. Push, release, snap. It takes 1/10 of a second, but in training, Mac wasn't wearing thick, wet wool gloves. And in training, his hands weren't frozen blocks of ice with 0 sensation. He tried to pull his thumb back. The wool of his glove caught on the receiver. Just a thread, just a snag. That was enough. The bolt flew forward. Snap! It happened faster than his eye could follow. The heavy steel machined bolt slammed into the breech, trapping Mac's right thumb against the chamber. It didn't just pinch, it crushed. The force was designed to chamber a copper cartridge. Instead, it drove into bone and nail. Mac screamed. The sound was lost in the mortar explosions, but it echoed inside his own skull. He looked down. His thumb was caught in the machine. He pulled. It wouldn't budge. The spring tension was too strong. Panic, absolute blind panic. The Germans were at 100 yards. They were screaming. And Mac was fighting his own rifle. He was trapped by the very thing meant to save him. He had to use his left hand. He grabbed the operating rod handle. He hauled it back. It felt like pulling a train. The bolt slid open. He yanked his hand free. The glove was torn. The wool was soaked in red. Bright, impossible red. The pain hit him then. Nausea. A wave of dizziness. He looked at his hand. The nail was split. The flesh was mashed. Blood was pumping out, hot and steaming in the frozen air. It dripped onto the walnut stock. It dripped into the receiver. He stared at it. For a second, he thought about quitting. He thought about curling up in the bottom of the hole and holding his hand. It hurt so much. It hurt more than the cold. It was a throbbing white-hot bass drum in the end of his arm, but the gray wall was at 80 yards. Mac didn't think. He didn't decide. His body just reacted. He slapped the bolt forward again. This time it closed on the bullet, not his flesh. He raised the rifle. His right hand was slippery with blood. He couldn't feel the trigger anymore, not because of the cold, but because the nerves in his hand were overloaded with agony. He squeezed anyway. Bang! The recoil jarred his smashed thumb. It felt like being hit with a hammer over and over again. Bang, bang. Every shot was a fresh torture, but the pain did something strange. It woke him up. The cold was gone, the numbness was gone. There was only the fire in his hand and the enemy in front of him. He fired until the clip was empty. Ping. He reloaded. This time he didn't care about technique. He shoved the clip in and smashed the bolt handle with the palm of his hand, not caring if it bruised him. He was already broken. What was one more bruise? The barrel was smoking hot now. The snow on the handguard sizzled. The oil inside the action, mixed with his own blood, was finally warm enough to run smooth. The machine was working. Fueled by gunpowder and hemoglobin, Mac kept firing. He didn't count anymore. He just fed the beast. The wall broke. It didn't crumble like stone. It dissolved. The gray shapes stopped moving forward. They dropped. They crawled. They faded back into the white fog. The German assault had lasted 20 minutes. It felt like 20 years. Silence returned. It rushed into the vacuum left by the gunfire, heavy and absolute. Mac sat down in the bottom of his hole. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow. His hands started to shake. Not a little tremble, a violent, uncontrollable rattling. His right hand, the smashed one, was throbbing, in time with his heartbeat. Blood had soaked into the wood of the rifle stock, turning the walnut dark and sticky. Then the cold came back. It had been waiting. It reclaimed the battlefield instantly. The heat from the barrel dissipated into the freezing air. The metal of the receiver began to contract. The oil mixed with carbon and blood started to thicken again. The glue was returning. Sergeant Miller crawled down the line. He wasn't checking for wounds. He was checking the machines. "Keep them running," he rasped. His voice was cracked and dry. "They'll be back. Keep them loose." Mac tried to cycle the bolt. It was stiff. It was fighting him again. The heat of the battle had bought him a reprieve, but the debt was due. "It's freezing up, Sarge," Mac whispered. Miller looked at him. He looked at the jammed action. He didn't offer a rag. He didn't offer a bottle of oil. He offered the only chemistry set they had left. "Piss on it," Miller said. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't an insult. It was a technical instruction. "Open the bolt. Piss on the receiver. The heat will cut the grease. Do it, now." Mac stared at him. Then he stood up. His knees shook. He fumbled with the buttons of his trousers. His fingers were useless, smashed and frozen. It took him a minute. He leaned over the weapon. The greatest battle implement ever devised, the pride of Springfield Armory, the result of millions of dollars in research and industrial engineering. And Mac urinated on it. The steam rose up in a thick yellow cloud. The smell was sharp. Ammonia and cordite. It was disgusting. It was degrading, and it worked. The hot liquid melted the frozen sludge instantly. The bolt snapped forward with a wet metallic clack. Mac buttoned up. He felt empty. He felt less than human. He looked down at the rifle. It was wet and reeking, but it was alive again. This was the reality of the arsenal of democracy. Not shiny parades, not newsreel footage, but a 19-year-old boy peeing on a machine in a frozen forest just to make it kill again. Night fell early. The darkness was total. There were no fires allowed. A fire was a target. Mac sat in the bottom of the foxhole. A medic had come by an hour ago. He looked at Mac's thumb. He didn't clean it. The water in his canteen was frozen solid. He just wrapped a dirty bandage around it and tied it tight. "You'll keep the nail," the medic said. Maybe. That was it. No morphine, no ticket home. A smashed thumb wasn't a wound. It was just a mistake. It was called Garand thumb, a rookie mark, a badge of clumsiness. Mac looked at the bandage. It was already freezing hard, becoming a cast of blood and cotton. He held the rifle in his lap. He kept the action covered with a piece of dry canvas he had cut from a dead man's pack. He was listening. He wasn't listening for the enemy. He was listening to the math in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Ping. The rhythm wouldn't stop. It played over and over. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clip ejecting. He saw the empty chamber. He saw the seconds ticking away while he fumbled for ammunition. He knew now. He knew the secret. You don't win because you are brave. You don't win because you are right. You win because your machine works for 1 second longer than the other guy's machine. You win because you didn't run out of heavy metal clips. Mac touched the cold steel of the trigger guard. He didn't love the rifle. He hated it. He hated it for jamming. He hated it for eating his thumb. He hated it for needing his urine to function, but he held it tight. It was the only thing in the world that promised him a tomorrow. The temperature dropped to 25 below. Mac closed his eyes. He started to count. 1, 2, 3. The rescue did not look like a cavalry charge. It looked like geometry. At 0200 hours, the American artillery opened up. It was the 155th Field Artillery Battalion. They were 5 miles behind the line, drinking lukewarm coffee and reading maps under red flashlights. They did not see the enemy. They did not see the snow. They saw grid coordinates. They dialed the numbers into their sights. They pulled lanyards. The physics took over. For Mac, crouching in his hole, the world ended. The shells came in with a sound like a tearing sheet, then a vacuum, then the earth turned to liquid. The explosions didn't just kill, they erased. Trees that had stood for 50 years were turned into toothpicks in a nanosecond. The ground shook so hard that Mac's helmet kept sliding over his eyes. He didn't look up. He didn't cheer. You don't cheer for an earthquake, you just try not to get swallowed. This was the American way of war. Not the rifleman's skill, not the bayonet. It was the industrial delivery of high explosives. It was a factory assembly line, but the product was craters. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. Thousands of pounds of steel delivered on time to the correct address. When it stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, ringing silence. Mac peeked over the rim of his foxhole. The forest was gone. The white snow was now black, black craters, black stumps, black shapes that used to be men. The German assault force hadn't retreated. They had been deleted. The math of the artillery had beaten the courage of the paratroopers. Mac sat back down. He felt small. He felt obsolete. What was the point of his rifle, his frozen thumb, his panic, when a gunner 5 miles away could wipe out a grid square without spilling his coffee? He looked at his hands. They were trembling again. Not from cold this time. From the realization of how fragile the system was. One radio call, one wrong number, and the shells would have landed on him. It wasn't war. It was roulette. Morning brought no warmth. The sun was a pale, useless disk behind the gray clouds. The temperature held steady at 18 below. Mac climbed out of his hole. His legs were stiff. His joints popped like dry twigs. He walked forward into the kill zone. He didn't know why. Maybe to make sure they were real. The German bodies were frozen hard. They looked like statues toppled over in a museum. Their faces were white wax. Their eyes were open, staring at the sky that had killed them. Mac stepped over a machine gunner. The man was young, maybe 18, younger than Mac. He was curled around his weapon, trying to protect it, or maybe trying to get warmth from it. Mac looked down at the snow around the body. It was littered with brass casings, hundreds of them, and among the brass, the American debris. The en-bloc clips, the black metal skeletons that Mac had ejected in his panic. They were everywhere, little clusters of 8-round feeders. Mac kicked one with his boot. It skittered across the ice. That was the story of the battle, not the flags, not the speeches, just the piles of empty metal, the sheer weight of waste. He picked one up. It was cold enough to burn his skin through the glove. He put it in his pocket. A souvenir, not of victory, but of the mechanism. He realized then that he would never leave this forest. Part of him would always be here, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The war ended 5 months later. Mac went home. He married a girl from Ohio. He got a job at a Ford plant, putting steering columns into sedans. It was good work, repetitive, predictable. But at night, when the house was quiet, he would wake up sweating. He wouldn't remember the dream. He would only hear the sound, a sharp metallic ping. He would look at his right hand. The thumb was scarred. The nail grew back thick and crooked. It was a permanent reminder, a deformity shaped by a machine. He never went hunting. He never touched a gun again. When his son asked him about the war, about the heroes, about the glory, Mac would just look at his hands. He wouldn't talk about the medals he didn't get. He wouldn't talk about the cause. He would just say, it was cold. It was so cold. And he would leave it at that. Because how do you explain the math to someone who hasn't done it? How do you explain that you are alive because you remembered to pee on a bolt? How do you explain that the difference between a hero and a corpse is 4 seconds of reload time? You don't. You just sit on the porch and you count. You count the cars going by. You count the seconds between thunder and lightning. You count to 8. And you never, ever let yourself run empty.